When you watch something as a teenager, you don't really analyze it, you absorb it. It feels like a world you step into, not something you judge. The drama is amplified, the romance feels real, and even the worst decisions somehow make sense in the moment. But then you come back to it years later and it hits differently. The same scenes are still there, but now you start noticing what you missed before. The emotional immaturity, the weird power dynamics, the things that were played off as normal, but really weren't. Nothing in the story changed, just the way you see it did. Back in the day, Gossip Girl books and the show were my holy grail. I loved them, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, Gossip Girl follows a group of wealthy Upper East Side teenagers, Serena, Blair, Nate, Chuck, Dan, Jenny, and many more, whose lives revolve around status, relationships, scandals, and public humiliation, all watched over by an anonymous blogger exposing their secrets to everyone around them. And when I was younger, none of that really seemed strange to me. I first read the books when I was around 15 or 16 years old. I don't remember every detail anymore, but I still remember how differently I imagined everyone. In my head, they were more polished, more intimidating, almost untouchable in a way the show couldn't fully replicate. So when I eventually watched it, it looked very different from what I had built in my imagination, especially Serena. I still remember seeing Blake Lively as Serena for the first time. She was nothing like the version I had created in my head. The way she looked, carried herself, the energy she had, it all surprised me at first, but that disappeared pretty quickly because the world itself completely pulled me in. Everyone was beautiful, rich, perfectly dressed, and moving through Manhattan like they owned it. They partied constantly, drank at 16, skipped school whenever they wanted, and somehow lived lives that seemed more adult than actual adulthood. And when you're young, that doesn't look dysfunctional. It looks like freedom. But rewatching the show now, I realize most of that freedom was just really neglect. These characters were left alone to raise themselves emotionally while their parents disappeared into work, affairs, money, addiction, or their own personal chaos. Nobody was really supervising them because nobody was really parenting them. And as a teenager, I completely missed that. The very first episode of Gossip Girl I ever saw was the first episode of season 2, the one with the Hamptons White Party. And the difference between how I saw it as a teenager versus how I see it now as an adult honestly plays like two completely different shows. Back then, I was mesmerized. Everybody was beautiful, rich, effortless. The lighting was warm, the music was perfect, and every relationship felt dramatic in an exciting way. It looked like the kind of world you wanted to escape into. Now, watching it years later, all I can see is how deeply messed up everybody is. As a teenager, Serena feels magical. As an adult, she mostly comes across as a sad person. Almost every bad decision she makes somehow circles back to her desperate need for love and validation, especially from men, which very obviously comes from her father abandoning her. Serena spends years chasing the approval of a man who lies to her, disappears from her life, actively avoids her, and still somehow remains the person she wants the most. The frustrating part is that Serena actually had somebody like Rufus around, who could have become a stable father figure for her, but the show never really commits to exploring that properly. Instead, Serena keeps chasing the fantasy of finally being chosen by her real dad, even after he proves over and over again that he does not deserve her trust. At the same time, Serena can also be incredibly selfish and vindictive. Her treatment of Lola and her behavior as a gossip girl and the way she constantly falls into the same destructive patterns, while everybody around her cleans up her mess, become much harder to romanticize as an adult. Blair's frustration with Serena honestly makes a lot more sense now, but Blair is just as damaged in her own way. Serena seeks validation through love and attention, while Blair seeks it through control. Blair needs to be the smartest, prettiest, and most admired person in every room because deep down she's terrified of not being enough. And because of that fear, she can become genuinely cruel. Early Blair especially is fueled almost entirely by jealousy and insecurity. Serena threatens her naturally, Jenny threatens her socially, and Blair reacts to both by periodically trying to humiliate them into submission. Sometimes she gets so obsessed with maintaining control that she doesn't even care who gets hurt in the process, including the people closest to her. Throughout the series, Blair is given some of the show's heaviest storylines, from her eating disorder to her pregnancy and miscarriage, yet very little of it is explored with real emotional depth. Some of the situations Blair ends up in become genuinely disturbing when you remember how young she's supposed to to be. The show casually includes a storyline where Chuck essentially trades Blair to his much older uncle Jack for a hotel and later expects the audience to move past it because Chuck feels guilty afterward. And nothing really happens, so it's okay. Blair is barely an adult during all of this, and the fact that the show still frames Chuck and Blair as some grand romance afterward makes for a very bizarre watch. By season 5, the show keeps presenting Blair as mature and ready for adulthood, but most of her decisions actually highlight how emotionally immature she still is. She's only 21 years old, trapped in a relationship with Louis that is mutually manipulative from the very beginning. Neither of them is truly in love with each other. Blair is far more invested in the fantasy of becoming a princess and living out a perfect royal fairy tale, while Louis becomes increasingly possessive and controlling as their relationship falls apart. Nobody in this world is allowed to simply exist comfortably as themselves or to feel normal feelings. Little Jenny Humphrey learns that lesson the fastest. Jenny is the poster child for everything wrong with the Gossip Girl. She starts as a regular teenage girl, desperately trying to fit in into a world that constantly tells her she's not good enough. At first, you sympathize with her completely, but slowly she starts becoming exactly like the people whose approval she wanted. She manipulates people, schemes constantly, hurts others just to survive socially, and creates chaos everywhere she goes. But unlike Blair or Serena, Jenny still feels painfully young while doing all of it. And rewatching the show now, that part becomes too uncomfortable to ignore. The show constantly puts Jenny into sexual situations and storylines that feel incredibly inappropriate in hindsight. Out of all the characters, why did Jenny have to be the one given a drug-dealing storyline? Also, the obsession with her virginity alone is weird enough, but the entire situation involving Chuck feels like one giant humiliation ritual disguised as drama. What makes it even worse is knowing how young the actress herself actually was during filming. She was between 12 and 14 years old in season 1. I can't help but wonder what the obsession was with putting children into adult situations in TV shows during the late 2000s and early 2010s. Jenny may absolutely be villain at times, but I can't help but admire what she was capable of doing to make her dreams come true. Honestly, the show loses a lot of its energy after she leaves, which is probably why I don't have much to say about Dan. Early Dan works because he feels grounded compared to everybody else. He is witty, awkward, judgmental in a funny way, and his relationship with Serena actually feels believable in the beginning for about the first 5 episodes. But over time, his criticism of Upper East Side slowly transforms into an obsession with becoming part of it. He starts as an outsider looking in and ends as somebody completely consumed by the same world he claimed to hate, which happens to Vanessa too. And this was one of the biggest surprises rewatching the show as an adult, because I remember hating Vanessa when I was younger, but now I consider her one of the most normal people in the show, at least at first. She sees how shallow and destructive the Upper East Side is, but eventually even she gets pulled into the manipulation and status games after spending enough time around these people. In my opinion, she was at her best when she was briefly happy in a relationship with Nate. I may be in the minority, but I loved the two of them together. Speaking of Nate, most of the time he is more of a collateral damage than an active participant of the story. His parents fail him emotionally, forcing him to carry burdens no teenager should have to carry, and his grandfather plans his entire future without even asking him anything. A cherry on top is how the show repeatedly places him into relationships with older women while framing it as a sexy drama instead of what it actually is, a predatory situation. Looking at the Catherine storyline now is genuinely uncomfortable. What makes it even darker is that by the end of the show, Nate basically becomes part of that same cycle himself when he starts dating a 17-year-old girl, Sage. One more thing I found strange is how Nate and Chuck were such good friends. They don't really seem to have much in common, especially since Chuck might quite honestly represent the biggest identity crisis the show ever had. Because in the pilot, Chuck is a sleazebag. He tries to assault 2 girls in a single episode, and realistically, that should have permanently defined the character. But audiences loved the chemistry between him and Blair so much that the writers slowly transformed him into this tragic romantic antihero instead. And somehow, I reluctantly admit it, it kind of works. Sometimes, because underneath all that money and arrogance, Chuck is still a deeply neglected kid trying to earn love from a father who emotionally damaged him long before the show even started. He spends years trying to become worthy in the eyes of someone who was never capable of loving him properly in the first place. The best thing that ever happened to Chuck was the death of his father. None of this erases what he did, but it explains why the character became so compelling despite everything. And honestly, that contradiction describes Gossip Girl perfectly. I know this chapter is probably gonna sound washed out, like criticism you already heard so many times before, but I can't talk about Gossip Girl without talking about the show itself falling apart in real time. Because while rewatching it, I ended up making an absurd number of notes about plot holes, abandoned storylines, bizarre character decisions, and the feeling that somewhere around season 4, the show stopped knowing what it actually wanted to be. The first 3.5 seasons look like a completely different show compared to the last 2.5 seasons. The pacing shifts, the editing changes, even the music starts sounding strange, and more importantly, the characters stop behaving like people and start behaving like plot devices. I know Gossip Girl is a CW teen drama, not a soap opera, but sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Early on, the chaos still feels grounded in character. Later, it becomes mechanical. One of the clearest signs of that is how the entire show runs on misunderstandings, which when overused is a clear sign of bad writing. Nobody communicates properly, nobody listens. People overhear half a sentence, and suddenly 3 episodes of conflict exist because no one thought to ask a single follow-up question or give an honest answer when asked a question. Human communication basically doesn't exist in this universe, and over time, those misunderstandings stop being emotional and start being structural, like the writers moving pieces around to force another breakup, betrayal, or love triangle. By the end of season 5, though, it genuinely starts feeling like everybody mentally checked out and was just waiting for their contracts to end. The relationships between characters suffer most from this. Almost every couple becomes emotionally exhausted rather than emotionally compelling. Dan and Serena work beautifully for a short stretch early on because there is actual chemistry and vulnerability, but the show keeps forcing them back together long after they've stopped making sense. And the same thing happens with almost everyone else. Even Blair and Dan. On paper, I understand why that pairing exists. Blair is calmer around him. He challenges her intellectually in ways Chuck doesn't, and structurally, it gives the show a reset. But emotionally, it never fully worked. It always felt like Blair was trying to convince herself she could move on from Chuck because the show needed them separated to maintain tension. It creates a weird imbalance where the relationship functions for the plot but not for the characters, which becomes a pattern across the entire show. Characters no longer drive the story drags the characters wherever it needs them to go. The show, in my opinion, would have also benefited massively from a time jump, skipping over the entire college timeline, which ends up being one of the most exhausting parts of the series. By the end, none of the relationships really matter anymore because they're just loops: break up, reconcile, rinse, repeat. Same emotions, slightly different dialogue, which is why the focus gradually narrows into the Chuck and Blair show. Everything starts orbiting around them, and the series becomes increasingly dependent on whether you still believe in that relationship. And I get why people did. The chemistry is undeniable, the intensity works, the fantasy works. But by the end, the relationship is no longer about two people in love. It becomes more a cycle the show refuses to end because it became too iconic to break. The cherry on top were all the fake deaths, fake cancers, and Lily and Rufus's secret child, which should have permanently changed everything. The show introduces huge emotional consequences and then drops them the moment they become inconvenient. As a consequence, it corners itself into having to answer questions it was never really built to answer. I've seen Gossip Girl quite a few times, and I always end up at the same conclusion. Gossip Girl was never meant to have a real identity. At its best, the show understood that too, because for most of its run, Gossip Girl works not as a person, but as a reflection of the world these characters live in. A culture built on status, insecurity, performance, voyeurism, and public humiliation. Everyone fed it, everyone used it, everyone suffered because of it, while also weaponizing it against someone else whenever it benefited them. Gossip Girl only existed because the Upper East Side needed her to exist. That's why the reveal feels so wrong. Not because it's shocking, and not even because it creates major plot holes, but because it shrinks something that was always so much bigger than one person. Suddenly, the show is no longer about a toxic social environment corrupting everybody inside it, but the story of one guy secretly manipulating his entire friend group for years. And that version of the story just doesn't fit. The moment the show turns Who is Gossip Girl into its central mystery, everything starts falling apart. Because Gossip Girl was never built like Pretty Little Liars, where the anonymous figure is the core engine of the story. The real appeal of Gossip Girl was always the characters, relationships, betrayals, friendships, and the fantasy of that world itself. Once Dan is revealed, the entire show starts creating problems for itself retroactively. Because why would Dan publicly expose his own relationship with Miss Carr in season 2? Why would he release blasts that directly humiliate Jenny? Why would he post things knowing they could destroy his own relationships, including Serena? These are countless moments throughout the series where the reveal simply does not align with what we are shown on screen. On top of that, it just makes Dan look like an awful person. It even makes Serena look bad, as she ends up marrying someone who not only exposed her for years, but whom she also shares a sibling with. They find out this big secret and somehow everyone just moves on. The finale doesn't spend any time on judging Dan for being someone who hurt people closest to him, and presents him as an outsider who wrote himself into the rich world of Upper East Side he apparently always wanted to belong to. To me, all of this proves that Gossip Girl was always strongest as a reflection of everybody's worst impulses, not one mastermind, all of them. Thank you so much to everyone who took time to watch this video, like and comment, and a special thank you to all of my 959 subscribers. I really appreciate your support and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.